Welcome everyone to the American Tax Policy Institute's webinar, Tax, Race, and Reparations, Reckoning with History, Rethinking the Future. I'm Bridget Crawford. I'm the president of ATPI, here with three of the leading voices in tax studies, Stephen Dean of Boston University, Dorothy Brown of Georgetown University, and Anthony Infanti of the University of Pittsburgh. We're thrilled that you've joined us today. We are going to hear from each of our authors without taking questions in between, but we very much hope to leave some time at the end of the program, at which point audience members, you're very welcome to put questions into the chat and we'll make sure those get to our speakers. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Infanti.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you everyone for attending. This is, really great to be on the same webinar with Dorothy and Stephen, whose work I really respect and enjoy. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my book, which is The Human Toll, Taxation and Slavery in Colonial America. And when I talk about the book, I always like to start out talking about how I came to write about the book, because I think it's kind of what's so cool about getting to be a professor, which is, so I work in critical tax, and one of my colleagues is a 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment scholar. So he's focused on the Reconstruction amendments, and he used to be our dean, and we're close friends because I was his associate dean. And so we're both not deaning anymore, not for a while now, but we're, talking in the hallway one day, and he said, I keep seeing these references to how in colonial times, they were using the tax system to compensate slaveholders for executed enslaved persons. Have you ever heard about this? Is this like a thing? Do you know about it? And I was like, no, I have never heard of this. I'm a tax person. I do critical tax. I have never, ever heard of this. And I was finishing up a different book then. So I said to him, please, can you just send me some of the references that you're seeing? Because it sounds like there's something there that, should be looked into. And so sure enough, he sent me the references, and I was, finishing up the book I was working on. As soon as I was done, I started looking into it, and it was just eye-opening to start doing the research. And so I went into the research, kind of looking at it and seeing, well, how were, the colonies using the slaveholder compensation schemes, through the tax system, how they were running them that way. But then I quickly realized the story was much bigger, and tax was really being pervasively used to support, promote, entrench the institution of slavery. From, kind of things that you might expect the tax system to do, which is, being used as a tool to mark enslaved people as a form of property, because you would see enslaved people in most of the colonies, not all of them, like 9 out of the 13 colonies had import taxes on enslaved people. There were 4 that didn't, largely because they just didn't have enough of a slave trade within the colony to justify having a tax. So the ones that did have a tax, they were marking enslaved people as property immediately upon entry into the colony, because they were taxing them, and typically taxing them, in the same legislation that was imposing import taxes on things like molasses and alcohol and things like that. So they were treating them as a commodity. And then while they were in the colonies, they were, subjecting them to property taxes. These took different forms in the different colonies, but they were all essentially forms of property tax, which was kind of an annual or more often reminder that these enslaved people were being treated as property. And that was, it's like probably what, people might expect to see the tax system do, but the tax system did so much more in promoting and entrenching slavery in the colonial period, because not only was it marking enslaved people as property, but the import taxes were being used as an active tool to basically control the enslaved population, because they would use the import taxes to control the inflow of enslaved people. And so you could see this in different ways. Probably the most common way is they would have, kind of differential taxes based on where the enslaved people were being brought from. Oftentimes, the taxes on enslaved people coming directly from Africa were lower than the taxes on enslaved people coming from other colonies, either in along the American seaboard or from the Caribbean. And that was because they perceived the ones that were coming from, the Caribbean or coming from the other American colonies as basically quote unquote troublemakers, people who were being shipped off from wherever they were because they've been causing trouble. And so they figured that the enslaved people coming directly from Africa would be, more tractable, easier to control. And so they wanted to encourage, the importation of enslaved people directly from Africa as opposed to seasoned enslaved people from other colonies. So they were using it that way. So that way they could better control the enslaved population that was in place, using taxes directly to do that. At times, they would use taxes to really control the flow. I mean, in the sense of, jacking up the tax rate to try to deter the importation of enslaved people. And you saw this in South Carolina, which people sometimes don't realize, but South Carolina was a majority Black colony for most of the colonial period. There were more enslaved Black people in South Carolina than there were whites, beginning from about 1708, all the way through the end of the colonial period. And so there was a lot of fear in South Carolina about uprisings by the enslaved population because it was numerically much bigger than the white population. And so there were times when they were, kind of very scared, fearful of, these uprisings. And so they would, jack up the import tax rate to ratchet down the importation of enslaved people. And I apologize if you can hear my dog barking in the background because the mailman just came. He does not like the mailman. So sorry, he's on a different floor, but he's very loud. It's like no matter what I do, and I was kind of praying the mailman would not show up during this webinar, but that's how things go sometimes. But so to get back to what I was saying, so like in South Carolina in the late 1710s, the 1740s after the Stono Rebellion, and in the late 1760s, they jacked up the import tax rate on enslaved people really high. And they basically, I mean, they didn't completely cut off, but they really curbed the importation of enslaved people in order, thank you, Jeremy, in order to kind of control the balance. They were afraid, because you would see, I mean, this is one of the things that was fascinating, especially about South Carolina. It was just how upfront they were about what they were doing and why they were doing it. They would include these preambles in the legislation, and they would explain exactly what they were doing in often very racist terms, and made no bones about it. And, they'd say things like, we can't believe the white population is not, growing the way we want it to be, but the Black population is growing a lot and we need to control that and, get it down. And so that's why we're jacking up the import tax rate. So that's not like trying to read into what people are doing. They're very upfront about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so you saw that there. I mean, you saw similar things happening in the North, in the New England colonies. So in the early 1710s, there was actually a war between the settlers in North South Carolina and the Native Americans. And so that people in the Carolinas were, capturing Native Americans and then shipping them up as enslaved people up to the North, which the northern colonies, the New England colonies, were not happy about because they had a lot of Native Americans in the area, including, enslaved Native Americans of their own. And they felt like this was, again, a situation of troublemaker. They're shipping up troublemakers that was going to make it hard for them to control the enslaved population in place and control the Native Americans, even that weren't enslaved. And so they, a few of the colonies imposed direct prohibitions on the Native American slave trade and just the Native American slave trade. But New Hampshire, it styled it as a prohibition, but the way it was actually operated was it was a heavy import tax on enslaved Native Americans coming into the colonies to try to stop that from happening. You saw something similar in New Jersey and Pennsylvania where they increased the import tax rate on enslaved Blacks after a rebellion in New York City. New York didn't. They never did. They seem to be all in on slavery in New York City and New York generally. But the neighboring colonies of Pennsylvania and New Jersey were very upset about what had happened in New York, were afraid it was going to happen there, and so they increased their import taxes for the same reason. They're trying to control the enslaved population in place. So you're seeing that happening. And then kind of like the last leg of all of that, because I see it as kind of almost like three legs of a stool supporting slavery. You have the property taxes, the import taxes, And then you have the slaveholder compensation schemes, which is how I entered into thinking about this. And people think slaveholder compensation schemes, that doesn't really sound like it's tax. Um, but it is about tax. It's actually a lot about tax because the slaveholder compensation schemes were created because it became quickly clear that if they were going to have draconian slave codes, particularly down south, I mean, so you think South Carolina had a very draconian slave code where they often imposed the death penalty for all sorts of crimes on enslaved people. Um, it's not to say that they didn't impose the death penalty on other people. The death penalty was used a fair amount in the colonial period, but they were singling out certain crimes that would not have resulted in the death penalty for whites, but did result in the death penalty for enslaved blacks. And if you step back and think about it for a second, um, the at that point, if the slaveholders are viewing enslaved people as basically an investment, their labor that they're controlling, having the state or the colony um, turn around and kill their enslaved people was destroying their financial investment. And so they needed to get slaveholders buy-in for doing this. And they realized this in part really quickly, like in South Carolina, because a large part of the legislature, of course, was comprised of slaveholders. So they knew exactly what the mindset was. Because what would happen if they didn't provide compensation is that the slaveholders either would just conceal the crime, if they could, or if it was bad enough, they would ship the person off the colony and sell them somewhere else. They could recoup their investment and offload the trouble onto another person. Um, and so they knew that this is probably what was going to happen. And so they needed to get the buy-in of slaveholders. And so they created these compensation schemes. But, compensation schemes don't do anything unless they're funded. And so you need to have taxation to fund them. And South Carolina in particular was just a fascinating kind of microcosm of how this worked, because in the early period, they were really experimenting with how they funded the slaveholder compensation scheme. They had a slaveholder compensation scheme from very early on. At first, it was funded just with general tax revenues, like whatever was in the colonial treasury. But then, as time went by, they then decided to change because they were getting lots of payments that they were having to make, and it was becoming burdensome. So they decided to restrict it to just being the slaveholders. The local slaveholders were the ones that were going to be taxed to pay for compensation for enslaved people executed in their area, which would, of course, do something else that tax is often used for, create incentives. Because if all these local slaveholders who all know each other know that if they can just adjust their behavior so that way their enslaved people don't commit crimes that result in the death penalty, they can avoid paying this tax. So it creates an incentive to change their behavior. Then, after some time went by, they kind of expanded a little bit, make it more regional, like not just very local. Um, and then eventually they go to, having it be colony wide. And when they go to having it be colony wide, it's at a time when the legislature is kind of jockeying over who has the power of the purse, and the Commons House of Assembly is the one that ends up, getting control and getting power over the purse, because that was the elected House of the Legislature, not the appointed House of the Legislature. And so they would vet these slaveholder payments. Um, and what was kind of really fascinating about it was how they constructed their property tax in South Carolina at that point. Because it had developed over time a little bit, but by the early 1730s, basically what was happening is that they would issue, a call, like in the newspapers in South Carolina starting in 1732, everyone who owes money, who's owed money from the colony, put in your claim. We will vet the claims, and then we'll pay the ones that we think should be approved. And that included slaveholder compensation claims. So they'd get all these claims come in, they'd vet them all, approve however many of them they approve, and they would create a list of all the people that were to be paid and how much they were to be paid. Then to create the property tax for that year, they would say, okay, let's add up all of those. That is exactly how much tax we're going to collect. And then they'd create the property tax to collect exactly that amount of tax. And the property tax would then say at the end, okay, here's attached to this legislation is a schedule or an estimate, it would be called, of all of the payments that need to be made. And the colonial treasurer can use the money raised under this property tax to pay those items and nothing else. So there was a direct link between taxation and these payments. The amount of the payments, was determining exactly how much the tax level was, and the taxes are being raised to pay exactly those amounts. And so you're seeing kind of the messaging that is being sent at different times about who benefits from these payments. I mean, because tax is expressive. When you're just making local slaveholders fund the payments, then it looks more like you're asking the slaveholders to internalize a cost of making money with enslaved labor. Like it's part of their business and they should have to absorb that themselves. But as you move to kind of redistributing that loss more broadly, eventually at the colonial level, they're doing it and they're doing it saying that this is of public benefit. This is a benefit to everybody, whether you own enslaved people or not. Everyone benefits from this. And so therefore everyone should be shouldering the burden of this. So it's sending, distinct messages about, who's benefiting from this, what role does this play in society? And what was fascinating was seeing how this worked in different sections of the colonies. Because like in the North, no slaveholder compensation schemes in New England. So you don't have this kind of a tie. The middle colonies, yes, you definitely have slaveholder compensation schemes, but not so much like in the South, spread at the colonial level. They're more localized, sending messages about how closely tied slavery was to the economy and to the society, which was fascinating. And I think I'm basically out of time. So I'm going to stop there. And if people have questions, I am more than happy to answer questions during the question period.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll turn it over to Professor D.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Bridget, for organizing this, and thanks also to Dorothy and Tony for participating. It's just really exciting to be on this virtual stage with all of you. It's really a privilege. All of you have been a real influence in my work, and I'm grateful for all that you've done and all that you're still doing. You're still working. It's not just resting on your laurels, doing new and very interesting work. All right, so I'm talking about a book that came out last year, Racial Capitalism, International Tax Law, The Story of Global Jim Crow. And I'm going to talk, maybe not for my full 15 minutes, so maybe it'll turn into something of a conversation. But, professors always say that, and they talk for 20 minutes. So we'll see what actually happens here. And I'm going to share just 3 slides if I can manage that. Let's see. Whoops, no, let's see, try one more time. There we go. But I'm on the wrong slide, so I will go back to, all right, back to the beginning. Okay, let's pretend that all worked smoothly. So this is the title of the book, and just the 3 slides that I'm going to share. I'll start with this one. So why did I write this book? So this book is telling the story of why we can't tax multinationals. And this is the story of this graph. So this graph, if you're trying to produce, a movie montage of bad things, you might have this graph as one of those things showing how bad things are. And what is this? You can read it. This is a table I borrowed from the Treasury Department. And what this is showing is corporate income tax, and this is just in the US, corporate income tax receipts as a share of total federal revenues from 1950 to 2003. So this is telling a story of the slow erosion. Is that slow? Steady erosion of the corporate tax. And this is to me a real mystery. In tax, we often hear about the rise of the individual income tax, and maybe as part of that, you can see the decline of the corporate tax. But there's a different chart, and I'm not going to show this one, but it shows the same corporate income tax receipts as a share of GDP. So sort of not sort of not going to be offset by increases, not be affected by increases in the individual income tax, and it's the same story. payroll taxes rise, individual income taxes rise, and the corporate tax falls over this period. And the mystery is, to me, is why. Why over this period is this happening? And as I was working on this book, the book is that is not the original title. And in fact, when I sent it to Oxford a couple years ago, the manuscript, they said, Steve, you didn't mention race in your proposal. And I said, that's because, and Dorothy will confirm this, it's so easy to think that race has nothing to do with it. I mean, it's international tax. What could race have to do with it? Why would I include that in my proposal? It was only when I was writing and researching in earnest that I realized the problem. And I had help as well from another source. This is from another one of our colleagues, Omri Marian, who published an article about tax treaties. He was trying to figure out where the language of contemporary tax treaties is coming from. Was it coming from the US model, the UN model, the OECD model? Just sort of in passing, he included this chart that was the number of tax treaties enforced by year. And you see something very interesting. So in international tax, the conventional wisdom is we set up this international tax system that we still have in the 1920s, long before we knew how rapacious multinationals would become in the future. So of course it doesn't, these double tax treaties that were created for purely benevolent reasons are not effective today, or at least are subject to abuse by these multinationals. And I suppose that's why he started the chart in 1920. But what it reveals is there really were no treaties for decades. It just didn't happen. That story that you've been told, and you'll read, by some of our most eminent and respected tax scholars, that this was set up in the 20s. We've been stuck with it for 100 years, and nothing has changed. Just isn't true. Right? It just didn't happen that way. So, what was the real story? Why did this happen in this way? So, one more slide, then I'll stop sharing. So this is from the CIA's map library, and it shows Africa before and after 1960. So the color coding is a little bit off, but on the left, this is Africa in 1959, and the dark gray bits were independent countries. And on the right, the light gray bits were independent countries. So 1960 is known as the Year of Africa. More than a dozen countries became independent in 1960. And on one specific day in 1960, I'm going to stop sharing now. I think you've seen that. All right, so yeah, we can stop sharing. So on the same day, December 14th, 1960, two things happened. The UN issued a declaration on independence, longer title than that, but that's the basic thrust of it. And on the very same day, the OECD was formed. So this is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It was formed by taking the Organization for European Economic Cooperation and adding Canada and the United States, instant global organization, right? Add North America to Europe, and that's global. And they slowly took over global tax policy. There's a great book by Nikki Teo, a wonderful scholar out of Australia, and she details all the incredible work that happened at the UN in the 1950s that none of us has ever heard about before she did it. We were all told it didn't happen, it wasn't true, and it certainly did happen, and they really tried very hard to create a very global South-friendly international tax regime at a time when, again, there were very few double tax treaties, and the OECD embraced the 1920s vintage double tax treaties, and Stanley Surrey, who we all know, was Kennedy's chief tax advisor in the early 60s, and he writes in his autobiography that he approved of this embrace of the 1920s era double tax treaty. And again, he knew one of the other things that Stanley Surrey was doing at the time. He was leading an investigation in Switzerland because of corporate tax abuse involving Switzerland. And he was leading this investigation so vigorously that the Swiss Attorney General threatened to prosecute his team. So he was taking no prisoners, as we can imagine Surrey was wont to do. So that was what he was doing on the one hand. But what's so interesting is the reason that Switzerland was the hub of corporate tax abuse at the time, and remains to this day, is that it had one of the early treaties. It had a 1953 U.S. Switzerland treaty that made it possible for this to happen. So Surrey knew this. He knew that corporate tax abuse was a problem. In a message to Congress, Kennedy specifically identified Switzerland as a problem, but they went ahead and did this anyway. And when you read some of the history of this era, so for example, historian Vanessa Ogle writes about what was happening during the decolonization of Africa. And she notes specifically that there was an enormous racial panic that she describes, and one of the threats that was perceived, and she's not an historian, one of the threats that was perceived in the independence of African countries was that they were going to impose tax on multinationals. That is what they were going to do to build the schools and hospitals that were never produced during the colonial era. So again, you think back to those charts, right? Corporate tax receipts plummeting over decades for no apparent reason. You see treaties again flourishing for no apparent reason, right? We're told that they're for preventing double taxation, but through that entire period, not counting World War II, but in the post-World War II era, where there was an incredible amount of economic growth, there were no double tax treaties or very few, yet we managed to muddle through. So what were they for? They were, in my view, a reaction, a way of staving off this anti-Black racial panic that happened along with the decolonization of Africa. Again, this is not the story that I thought I was going to tell at all when I started writing the book. And part of me still hopes it's wrong, but I don't think so. And I certainly don't think that it is, I don't think it is 100% of the story, but I also don't think it's 0%. And if you really want to understand why we can't tax multinationals today, right, this is still a real thing, why we can't do it today, you have to look at the fact that there is still never been an African member of the OECD. There has never been a majority Black member of the OECD. Could you possibly do better without that happening? I suppose, but the evidence is pretty damning that we have not. The good news, I like to end on a high note. The good news is that something that I've been excited to see for years and have written about, although really in a hopeful but purely aspirational way of seeing the work of global tax policy return to the UN. It's actually happening. A few years ago, the African group led by Nigeria basically demanded that this happen. And of course, all the OECD either abstained or voted against it. But as everybody knew in the 50s and 60s, when this is happening, the UN is a place where that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the OECD doesn't want this to happen because they're vastly outvoted. So that is, it's still taking shape. What will happen is not yet certain, but it's definitely a positive development. So I'm happy to take any questions now, or I don't know how you want to do it, Bridget. Whether the other panelists want to throw in a question, whatever in my remaining half a, 5 or so minutes, I'd be happy to do.
There were a couple of questions in the chat if you wanted to take them now, asking
Sure.
about what is the role of business type in federal revenue. Do you see any opportunities for work at the intersection of racial equality efforts and pass-through entities and international tax? Could you add those to your mix of your conversation?
I would say that, I'm not sure about that, but my sense is that what I'm seeing here is part of a larger pattern. And it's certainly possible that the kinds of dynamics that I'm seeing in the corporate tax rate and in the treatment of corporations, I'm a corporate guy. I find partnership tax totally mysterious and confusing. So I would assume that similar patterns are playing out in other areas. Certainly on the individual side, you see similar things happening. But I'm going to assume that the same patterns do play out no matter the type. When I use that chart, again, that I've just stolen from the Treasury Department of steadily declining corporate tax receipts, that really is more a symptom. I don't think that is the only problem, but if you don't have a good explanation for that, and again, I defer to the three of you. Do you have a good explanation for that steady decline starting in the 50s that continues until now? I haven't heard one, and I don't know why it isn't more discussed. And I assume that the same thing is happening in other areas as well.
Another question in the chat from our colleague Katie Pratt. Could you talk a little bit about what you see historically? Did the corporate tax go up in any countries from the 1960s on? Why are there winners and losers in this whole race?
So I think there are only losers. And that's one of the ironies. And that's what I think is so powerful about this being the US corporate tax rate, right? So the story that I tell in the book is really about rich countries winning at the expense of poor countries. And that also maps on to black countries losing, not coincidentally. But what's so fascinating is that Stanley Surrey did this to himself, right? He knew better, right? He was vigorously investigating Switzerland at the time for corporate tax abuse. You know, they were tracking the number of Swiss subsidiaries being formed by US multinationals, and then tracking the number as it fell after they created Subpart F, which was sort of a very discreet approach to responding to this without naming Switzerland as the culprit. Um, uh, and the fact that we did this to ourselves, and then of course the irony is that when the OECD and others try to understand what's happening in that chart, they look for a villain, and they of course don't look in the mirror. They instead look at uh, tax havens, and of course by tax haven they don't mean Switzerland, which both Kennedy and Surrey knew to be tax havens. They think about countries like the Bahamas, where I grew up, or Bermuda and the Caymans. I got part of the story of writing this book is me losing my temper, and I don't generally lose my temper, but just understanding that so much of what we've been told is just not true. So I wrote an open letter to Biden and the nation, and about him naming the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, as the reason that we couldn't have nice things. And his experts knew that there were seven tax havens that they were looking at, even if you want to accept this idea of tax haven and that the U.S. isn't one. But he names the only two black ones on that list and leaves out Ireland and Switzerland. And when I did that, I got a call from one of his chief advisors, someone we all know, but I won't name them, because even though I'm mad, I'm not that mad, telling me, "Oh, well, next time we do something wrong, why don't you just call us and tell us quietly?" Um, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm beyond that. I'm too mad for that. We have to name these things, and we have to name them publicly, even if it's going to make people uncomfortable.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll turn it over to Professor Brown.
Thank you, Bridget. I'm delighted to be on the panel with Stephen and Tony as well. I'm going to talk about my new book, Getting to Reparations. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is how is it this tax law professor is writing a book about reparations now? I can talk about Boris Bitker was the first one to do it. I'm only the second one. But I will say when I finished writing The Whiteness of Wealth, I realized that there was nothing that was going to fix the racial wealth gap other than reparations. That we could come up with the perfect federal income tax system that no longer disadvantaged Black Americans, and we still would have a growing racial wealth gap. So I said to myself, okay, I've got to write a book about reparations. Well, the problem was I'm a skeptic on reparations. So how am I going to write a book about reparations when I'm not sure I believe in reparations? Well, I was having coffee with a colleague, I was at Emory at the time, who mentioned that she teaches foreign relations and she talked about her class and how the United States government paid reparations to Italy for Italians lynched in Louisiana. And I said, wait a minute. Are you telling me that we paid reparations for lynching, but not to Black people to Italy? She goes, that's exactly right. And I never got past that point. Picking up on what Stephen said about we weren't taught. I'm like, what else don't I know? If I don't know that we paid reparations to Italy for lynched Italians in Louisiana, what else have we paid reparations for? So I can pick up on what Tony said, because the first instance that I talk about in my book, I talk about four incidents. I call them precedent. And as a lawyer, if you can show how we did something before, then we can do it again. So the four precedents that are the basic building blocks of getting to reparations begins with the DC Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862, where the Treasury paid enslavers, white enslavers in DC when enslaved people were freed in the District of Columbia. And that was the second example I found. And I said, oh, so we paid a country on behalf of white people lynched in Louisiana, and now we're paying white enslavers for the freeing of enslaved people. So we can figure out how to pay reparations to white people, but somehow we can't pay compensation to Black Americans. Well, the third example I found was the Indian Claims Commission, where tribal nations were paid compensation for land theft and economic exploitation. Oh, okay. I said, okay. So finally, I found an example where we didn't just pay white Americans for harms that had happened to people of color. But I will say with the DC Compensated Emancipation Act, as well as the Italy reparations, those payments happened quickly. Like DC Compensated Emancipation Act was paid out within a year. And you had a three-person commission who considered the petitions. And I was really listening to what Tony was talking about. It was intricate. The petitions had to describe each enslaved worker, their height, what they did, how they came to own them. They were quite intricate. And what usually occurred in the census was you had a number, but you didn't have names. Well, these petitions had names. So I could tell you who the enslaved workers were. Okay, and they paid the money rather quickly. The Indian Claims Commission, that took over 20 years. So when we find a precedent where we're not paying white Americans, it takes a little longer. In fact, they were mini trials. No tribal nation could get money before they were able to prove their case in some mini trial, which really happened rather quickly if we're talking about white enslavers in DC, but rather slowly when it came to tribal nations. And then the fourth example I talk about is the Japanese American reparations. So that one I knew about. I was alive at the time. That one I knew about. But I learned a lot in the process of how it came to be that Japanese Americans received compensation for their mass incarceration. So I zoomed out and I said, okay, we've paid reparations for the end of slavery. We've paid reparations for lynching. We've paid reparations for land theft and economic exploitation. And we've paid reparations for mass incarceration. Pretty much most of the entirety of the Black experience in America. So to me, that was precedent for why we could pay reparations, why we could compensate for the harm that slavery and the end of chattel slavery, which didn't really end slavery, produced. So I had the first building block of my book. I was no longer a skeptic. I was we can get this done, but there are going to be some challenges, shall we say. Um, in the process of when I wrote The Whiteness of Wealth, I visited at Georgetown Law School and I did a job talk at Georgetown Law School because they were considering me for a job. Spoiler alert, I got it. That's why I'm on the faculty at Georgetown. But my job talk was my reparations book. And I said to myself, this is going to be interesting. You know, Georgetown has this reputation of being very left, but I will tell you, just because you're left doesn't mean you're actually good on race, right? So it's one thing to be left, it's another thing to be um, racially conscious or racially committed to equality. So a little nervous, but I also wanted if they were going to be my new colleagues, to know this was the next book. So if you don't want to touch me, I'm fine because I have a job. Well, the job talk went really well. I heard a lot of skepticism, which really made me think, okay, if this left-leaning faculty is pushing back, and they were Look, I will say this. One of the things that I love about being a member of the Georgetown faculty is how kind and generous we are to one another. Our faculty workshops are profoundly substantive, and I always get really good feedback. One of the pieces of feedback I got was they they weren't convinced that reparations was doable. They wanted me to call it something else. They wanted me to think about something else. They wanted me. So it was really eye-opening in the sense that I realized that I didn't have my messaging right. And one of the things I learned during my time at Emory, because one of my colleagues, Drew Weston, wrote this book called The Political Brain, and I talked with him a lot about how to talk about race to white Americans. His he always gave me advice that there was a message that would resonate. You just have to figure out what it is and then lean into that. So I was lucky. I had a stash of money at Emory that I was going to lose if I went to Georgetown, if I didn't spend. And the former investment banker in me said, "Oh, I'm not losing this, I'm spending it." So I did a mini focus group test. I hired a firm out of California and did a mini focus group testing messaging to find out what, if anything, would move people from opposition to support. And what I found was two things. When you tell people that we, in fact, have paid reparations to white enslavers for the end of slavery, to Italy for lynching of Italians in Louisiana, for land theft and economic exploitation to tribal nations, and to Japanese Americans for mass incarceration, they actually think it's unfair that we've never paid compensation for Black Americans. So there's a fairness argument that resonates across racial group members of the focus group testing. And then the second part of the message that resonated is most people don't know history. And this actually resonated across racial lines as well. People don't know about FHA redlining. They don't know that the US Department of Agriculture did more to steal Black land from farmers than anything else. They don't know about the GI returning veterans from World War II who were denied access to GI benefits, so they didn't get jobs. They weren't approved for mortgages. They weren't able, even though they were fighting white supremacy abroad, they were victims of white supremacy at home. So our focus group members, when they heard about these two things, one, the precedent, and two, the harm was ongoing after the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were enacted. They actually moved from opposition to support. That's when I realized that the book I was writing was actually going to make some sense. Because I was like, I hope it makes sense. I hope it resonates because this is the book I'm writing. And the focus group testing really helped me pull it together. So the way Getting to Reparations is organized is part one are these four case studies. And I will just add Italians were not just lynched once in Louisiana. There were three separate instances where Italians, three separate times, were lynched in Louisiana and that we wound up compensating Italy for. So I just want to put that as an asterisk. It didn't just happen once, it happened three times. So, part one is about the case studies and what we can learn from the case studies. We've done it different ways. Sometimes we had a commission, sometimes it was just the State Department writing checks to Italy. Other times there were mini trials. So there were many different ways you can do it, but the idea that we can't do it, oh, we could do it, and we've done it before. So you can pick from case study one, you can pick something for case study two. Part two of the book talks about what happened at the end of chattel slavery. When chattel slavery ended, what happened to Black Americans? Now, part two of the book, which I call Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, almost made me quit writing the book. It was the most painful thing I've done because I was reading what was happening to Black Americans, and it was unimaginable what was happening to them. And it didn't matter where they were, whether it was the South or the North or the East or the West, they were the victims of exploitation. They were the victims of convict leasing. They were the victims of eminent domain where the state stole their property. They were the victims of lynching. Racial violence was always hanging over their head. Immigrants could get FHA insured mortgages, but Black Americans could not. So this was such a painful history. But at the end of the day, I said to myself, well, my ancestors experienced this. The least I can do is tell it. So that was part two of the book. And then part three of the book is okay, how do we actually get reparations? And my idea for getting reparations is going to start with a commission that the next Democrat elected president creates by executive order on day one when they're in office. You set up a commission, they study it, they make recommendations. They're required to make recommendations, which was why the Japanese American Commission was so successful. And then you get Congress to enact it, at which point you say, Dorothy, you are nuts. Well, here's the plan for the commission. And the commission is going to increase public support, which is a job this commission will have that no other commission was required to do. There was never any backlash of public support for any, well, actually, the DC folks did not want slavery to end. Nobody cared. Okay? If there was opposition, it was ignored. The idea that you have to have some public support in order to get reparations was never an issue in any other instance. But this is an example of Black exceptionalism, right? And we're talking about giving something to Black people, not giving something, compensating for systemic racism that Black people have experienced over 100 years. Well, suddenly now we have to convince everybody that this is the right thing to do. Well, with the focus group testing, there actually is we actually can make headway. But the other burden that the commission is going to have will be building public support, something that I think is eminently doable because what I've since done since joining Georgetown is and after writing the book, I got an extended grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So we've done so much more in-depth focus group testing, which reaffirmed what the preliminary results showed us. So I think it's eminently doable. I think the times we are living in makes it even more likely that reparations occur for Black Americans because in this day and age, I think it's hard for well-meaning white Americans to think we're post-racial. We are anything but post-racial. And I think the fact that it's so in our face now is so critical to building a multiracial coalition to support reparations. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over is where's my work headed next? So I finished getting the reparations. I'm writing another book. And the next book I'm working on is about billionaires because there's just so much to say about white supremacy and billionaires, and I plan to say it all. So with that, I will end.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. These books are incredibly thought-provoking and generative of amazing conversation. If folks in the audience have questions you'd like to send to all of our panelists or any one particular of our panelists, you can go ahead and put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. While we wait for some questions to come in, maybe I'll start with a few of my own, and I'll put this to all three of you. So all three of you really show us, not just tell us, but show us in a deep and abiding way that tax law has never been neutral. It structured hierarchy in colonial America. It structures hierarchy in global markets. It structures hierarchy in modern domestic policy. And so I'd love to ask you, given this insight that tax law has built these systems, what would it mean from your perspective for tax law to play a role in actively dismantling them? What might that architecture look like? And I know that we have a limited amount of time, so you can't sort of map out a full plan, but just anything that comes to your mind as part of how tax could play a role in dismantling the hierarchy. And maybe we can go in the order of our speakers. So Professor Infanti, Professor Dean, Professor Brown.
Well, what comes to mind, so when I end my book, I actually bring it up to the moment and think about what the history of, tax's role in supporting and promoting slavery in colonial America has to say about reparations today. Um, and I think, kind of the important thing is kind of taking some of the lessons that you can draw from what they did in colonial America. One is just the sheer level of tax imagination as they played around with the tax system to do their racist things that they wanted to do, and how unfettered they were compared to anyone who tries to come up with a reparation scheme today, whose hands are very much tied by the US Supreme Court. And so thinking about, kind of trying to change the composition of the Supreme Court, get different interpretations of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments that are more in line with what they were meant to be when they were created. Kind of abandoning this notion that we have to have a colorblind constitution is important. I mean, that's, I think, one thing to take from it, from tax, that would help. The other thing is being sensitive to how we do it. Because I've heard, people will say money is fungible. Money is not fungible. Okay, where the money comes from makes a difference. And you can see this in the reparation schemes that some, states and localities have tried to do. And so you think about, like, Providence, Rhode Island used money from the American Rescue Plan Act to do some reparations. Well, that money was tied by having to be spent in a race neutral fashion, which means that their reparation scheme not only benefits Native Americans and Blacks who were enslaved, and just mind you, Rhode Island, and particularly Providence, Rhode Island, they were the huge players in the American slave trade. Huge, huge players. And they used the money from their import taxes to build all the infrastructure of the colony of Rhode Island. All the bridges, all the roads, paid for with import taxes from enslaved labor. Um, Half the people that are eligible for their reparation scheme are whites, because they had to do it in a race neutral fashion. So where the money came from was important. Same thing when you look at, like, Evanston, Illinois, where they decided to do reparations for housing discrimination. They first looked to the cannabis tax that they were, going to be imposing because they had just legalized cannabis in Illinois. They were hoping to get the money from there. Did not work. There's not enough money. And then, they turned to a new tax on basically mansions, the transfer of mansions. What does that tell you, though, about what they're trying to do? This is supposed to be the community atoning, but where's the money coming from? Is it coming from the community? No, it's coming from cannabis users and from very wealthy people, and both, by the way, brand new taxes that were not devoted to anything already, which means that they weren't having to sacrifice any other kind of a program to do this. So the choices you make when you tax say a lot about what you're actually doing. And so I think bearing that in mind as you, play through what does a reparation scheme look like is important. And those are all things that, they were keenly aware of in the colonial period, like where the money comes from, who's paying the taxes that are used to fund slaveholder compensation was top of mind.
Purpose or deed.
You're
You're
still
on
on mute.
mute.
Try it again. Another example that Dorothy didn't mention in her talk was the reparations that Haiti paid to France for its independence, right? So if you read the news about Haiti now or over the past decades, you'll understand how damaging and how impactful those reparations were. So, that does suggest that there is, has been at times an appetite for reparations on the global level, and I do think that it would be very hard to make that happen in that dramatic a fashion at the international level. But it's certainly possible to change the way tax revenue is allocated across the globe, and there is unfortunately still to this day. There's an anthropologist who wrote a book about the current process the OECD is engaging in to create a reform of the global tax system. And this anthropologist, I guess their job is to get people to talk. I don't know how she manages to do it, but she got this anthropologist, or she got this country official from the global north to talk about why they didn't want to agree to a more fair allocation of global tax revenues. And she was very honest. She was like, yeah, these African countries, why would we give them more? They have to sort of figure out how to to get their house in order before we share global tax revenues with them. So, if these kinds of attitudes are still informing in a way that they're very unself-conscious of. I guess they wouldn't want their name attached to it, but they certainly don't think there's anything wrong with what they're saying. So it's certainly possible to imagine a world, even if France doesn't reverse, doesn't just cut a check for the reparations that Haiti paid to it or more, which would be great. There's certainly ways to make sure that tax revenues flow into the fisc of the global South. That's certainly entirely possible. And I'll share one more slide. There's one more thing that I think would be very helpful. Let's see if I can do this more smoothly this time. Yeah, okay, so here we go. So this slide is from the OECD's brochure that it published just a few years ago, 2021, to explain what it wanted to do to fix global tax policy. And what I love about this, or hate about it, of course, is the bottom of the triangle. So they show what's wrong with global tax policy, and the solution is their 15% minimum global minimum tax. And they know they can't say tax haven anymore. So they want to explain why this is not their fault. And so they use this image, which I think is more subtle, I guess, but ultimately is maybe less subtle, as a way of blaming not against Switzerland, which since the Kennedy administration we knew was the problem, but tropical islands that in their telling are just laden with cash, which again, if you know anything about corporate tax and international tax, corporations are not hiding money anywhere. That's not something they do. That would get all the executives fired if they pretended not to make as much money as they do. That is not what they do. So we could stop doing this. And I'm happy to report that the OECD first edited that brochure quietly without changing the copyright date to eliminate the palm trees, the coconut trees, and then they disappeared the whole brochure. They just scrubbed it from their websites, this major marketing brochure. So, it'd be great if the money went where it should go. But failing that, I think we could also at least do a better job of not using imagery like that.
Okay, I think I've got 2 minutes. So, in my 2 minutes, I will say two things. One is if you want to have taxes function in a racially equitable manner, the first thing you do is you provide tax data by race so that we actually know who's paying and who's not paying. And then the second thing is you exempt Black Americans from paying taxes, period, full stop. Because as I've said, we have for so long paid first class taxes for second class citizenship. So it's of course reparations shouldn't be taxed, just like the Japanese American reparations were not taxed. And my idea for reparations is not solely cash compensation, it's cash plus, because the system for building wealth in America is anti-Black. So we have to fix that system. So reparations should go towards fixing the system as well as cash compensation.
Lots more to talk about, but unfortunately, we are out of time. For folks who ask some questions in the chat, I'll be sure to pass those on to our panelists so that they can think about those going forward in their future work. And on behalf of the American Tax Policy Institute, thanks to all three of our speakers, thanks to our guests who joined us as audience members. And we look forward to seeing what these three amazing scholars do next. Thank you all for joining. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.